that you have all of your patterns. Front, top, side, front, top, center, back, top, side, back, top, center, front facing collar. Sleeve, flounce. Front skirt side, front skirt center, back skirt side, back skirt center. Get 4 flounce panels. Sew them together along the short edge with a 1 cm seam allowance, creating a long strip of fabric. On the wrong side, fold up the hem by 0.5 cm and iron well. Then top stitch from the folded edge. Along the inside curve, sew 2 rows of gathering stitches. First, divide the flounce into half. For the first half, sew 2 rows of gathering stitches on the top, as well as for the second half. Sew 2 of the remaining flounce panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance, creating a medium-sized strip of fabric. On the wrong side, fold up the hem by 0.5 cm and iron well. Then top stitch from the folded edge. On the inside curve, sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top. Repeat this step for the other flounce panel. Sew the front top center and back top center together along the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. Gently gather the 2 panel flounce to match the width of the front top center. Repeat for the back. Sew the flounce to the top with a 1 cm seam allowance. Repeat for the back. Gently gather the 4-panel flounce to match the width of the front and back top center. Then sew the panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew 1 set of back and front top side panels together along the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. This is the front center, front side, back center, back side, and the shoulder seam. Mark out all the notches from the paper pattern on all panels, the center as well as the front side. Tuck in all the flounce panels and sew the side to the center panels with a 1 cm seam allowance, making sure that the notches match up. On the wrong side of the collar, mark out all the notches from the paper pattern. Shoulder, center front, shoulder, center back. Fold the collar into half. On the side with the center back, so 1 centimeter along the short edge. On the side closest to the shoulder, sew in an L shape with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, stopping exactly at the shoulder notch. Grab a pair of scissors and snip exactly into the shoulder notch, stopping right in front of the stitches. Turn it inside out and iron well. Check for a right angle shape. Mark out all the notches along the neckline. On the front, the collar notch, center front, shoulder seam. On the back, center back, collar notch. Sew the collar to the neckline, making sure all the notches match up. Pin to secure and then sew them together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Grab one set of back and front top side panels and sew them together at the shoulder with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Sew the front facing panels together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance on the outer edge. Then grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce the bulk. Turn inside out and iron well. Then top stitch along the outer edge. On the front side panel, sew the front facing together, starting exactly from the shoulder seam all the way down with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Before we attach the side to the center panels, mark out the notches on the back side and back center panels. Tuck in the flounce panel and sew the back side to the back center with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. With the right sides together, sew the front and back panels together at the side with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. On the right side, to keep the flounce from staying flat down, understitch on the front center panel, making sure to catch onto the seam allowances below. Sew from the front all the way to the back. Flip to the back center, understitch on the back center panel, making sure to catch onto the seam allowances below. This is the outer top completed. Let's begin on the inner top. Mark out all the notches on the back center panel and back side panels. Sew them together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. For the front, take one front side panel, mark out all the notches. Sew them together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Sew the front and back panels together along the shoulder and side seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This is the inner top completed. Sew the inner and outer top panels, right sides together, matching up the neckline and armholes. Tuck in the collar and front facing before sewing. Tuck in the flounce panels. Tucking in the front facing as well. Match up the shoulder seams. Sew the inner and outer panels together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance along the opening and neckline. Check that everything is tucked in nicely, and along the neckline, check that there are no folds on both the inner and outer panels. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce tension and bulk. Turn it inside out. Check that the collar, front facing, and flounce are all not accidentally sewn down during the previous step. Seal up the armhole by basting the outer and inner panels together with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Repeat for the other side. On the sleeve, mark out all the notches. Sew gathering stitch along the sleeve crown. Fold the sleeve into half and sew along the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Attach the sleeve to the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance, focusing most of the gathers close to the shoulder seam. Fold up the sleeve hem by 3 cm and iron well. Top stitch 2.5 cm from the folded edge. Repeat for the other side. Seal up the outer and inner top panels together by basting 0.5 cm at the waist. On the back skirt panels, both the center and side, mark out all the notches. Then sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance. On the front, center and side panels, mark out all the notches. Then only sew one side panel to the center panel with a 1 cm seam allowance. On the other side, starting from the zip notch, sew the zipper with a 1 cm seam allowance. At the bottom of the zipper, finish up the rest of the seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the front and back skirt panels together along the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Along the skirt hem, fold up by 1.5 cm and iron well. Then top stitch 1 cm from the folded edge. Sew the top to the skirt along the waist with a 1 cm seam allowance. Do not sew to the flounce or the front facing. The buttons on this side are just for show. On the front facing, hand sew buttons. On the front top center, sew button holes. For the collar, you may install a snap button or repeat the button and buttonhole process. And there you have it. Your dress is completed.